Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about World War II again, but the Pacific campaign, so kind of the second half of World War II. So we have just talked about the war in Europe, so the defeat of the Germans, and this was a big effort. So it's the British, the French, the Americans, the Russians, a lot of other smaller groups like the Canadians. So they're all fighting for one cohesive effort. With victory in Europe, they're able to kind of shift much of the resources that they were using to fight in Europe over to the Pacific. Now, this is going to be a massive campaign. So basically, I'm going to launch a two-pronged campaign. So one kind of going through the northern islands, one going through the southern islands, and they're going to hop from island to island, taking piece by piece back from the Japanese. And these are going to be some of the hardest battles of the war. This is particularly so because the Japanese had expert propaganda. They made the Japanese people on many of these islands believe that if the Americans came, the Americans were going to brutalize and torture and rape and murder and do all sorts of horrible things to them if they surrendered. So if the Japanese people surrendered, and then within the Japanese army, you had this idea of Bushido that they had twisted a little bit and made it to where dying in battle was kind of the only honorable way out. So either you win or you die in battle. So Japanese troops will fight almost always to the very last man. Now, of course, like we've talked about, Pearl Harbor is what brings the United States into the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor, which was a preemptive attack. Now, we couldn't strike back directly as a full-fronted force immediately, but we did have some aircraft carriers left, so we packed up some big bomber planes on those, and we're going to launch what's called the Doolittle raid. So we're going to sneak an aircraft carrier close to the main homeland of Japan, and then launch a bombing raid that'll bomb across Japan. Some of the planes will have to ditch into Russia, others will crash land into China. But there was no coming home for these guys until the war was over. But we were able to strike back at Japan to prove that we were not out of the war just yet. Chester Nimitz, a Texan from Fredericksburg, is going to be given command of this Pacific Fleet and the overall command of fighting the Japanese in this section of the war. Like I said, he's going to have this two-front war, and they're going to be fighting, trying to slowly take back all these islands that the Japanese had occupied. Kind of the first big move by the American forces, the American Navy, was the Battle of Midway. This is kind of a trap that was laid for the Japanese. There's a small island. It's technically part of the Hawaiian island chain, but it's very kind of far northwest of the main Japanese or main Hawaiian islands. It's a little atoll of Midway. Now, the Japanese wanted it because it would be a good launching point for the main Japanese islands as well as the California coast. But nonetheless, we know they're intercepting our communications because we're intercepting theirs. So we use certain code words and different things to leak out that something's going on at Midway, that the troops are moving away from Midway, and the Japanese take this as a chance to say, well, okay, we're going to attack now. But we were listening to what they were saying as well, so we kind of like fed them false information to trick them into attacking when we wanted to. And our Navy was waiting, and we are going to utterly decimate the Japanese fleet sent to Midway. So we will sink several of their aircraft carriers, and at this point they will not be able to fully recover for the rest of the war. While the US recovers from the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese never truly recover from Midway. The next big push is going to be at the Battle of Guadalcanal, so far south, kind of the Solomon Islands area. So this is our first time taking a major island from the Japanese. And there's going to be a huge learning curve for Guadalcanal. We'll spend 6 months fighting in the tropical islands. The Americans lost about 7,100 killed. The Japanese lost 31,000. This is because the Japanese refused to surrender. They fought virtually to the last man. Now you have Smokey the Terrier, aka a Smokey Doodle Dandy. Now he is a little dog that was adopted in one of these campaigns and actually rode and landed and fought with the unit and became kind of a mascot for it. Now they kept pushing further north, and you have the next major theater. So you have the China, Burma, India theater. So this is while we're fighting up through Southeast Asia, the British and Indian troops, along with the Chinese and some US troops, are fighting, kind of coming the other way towards Thailand and kind of the east coast of Asia. They have a very interesting story of Owen J. Baggett from Texas, who his plane was shot down in the Burma theater and he ejected and was parachuting down. And when the Japanese fighter pilot flew by, kind of slowed his plane down, flew by to make sure Baggett was dead, Baggett pulls his pistol out and actually kills the fighter pilot. And he has the record of the only enemy fighter pilot shot down with a pistol. So Texans, what do you know? But nonetheless, we keep pushing further inland. And you have the big battle of Iwo Jima. So this is about a month of fighting from February to March of 1945. There's about 20,000 casualties, including 6,000 dead on the American side, and almost all of the 21,000 Japanese defenders are killed. So this is the famous raising the flag and all this kind of iconic imagery coming from some of these battles. So you have Iwo Jima, then pushing on to Okinawa. Now Okinawa, while Okinawans may not consider themselves part of the Japanese home islands, Japan certainly did. And this was kind of the big base we needed to take, and the main island we needed to take, because this would put our bombers within range of Japan. So virtually every one of the 110,000 Japanese soldiers on the island fought to the death. Every third American soldier was either killed or wounded. Over 50,000 Americans were either killed, or wounded, so it's about 7,600 killed and over 40,000 wounded. By April of 1945, we took the island. But this was a hard-fought, bloody island to take. But this put us in range with our big B-29 bombers that could begin firebombing major cities in Japan. So you can see from this infographic kind of thing here, the massive level of firebombing. And you kind of have like what percentage of the cities that were burned by B-29 incendiary bombs. And the figures indicate, you can kind of see down here, what percent of the city was destroyed. And for comparison, each city is paired with a US city of roughly the same size. So like Tokyo, 40% of Tokyo was burned, and Tokyo was roughly the same size as New York. So this is massive, massive destruction. We bombed the hell out of the entirety of Japan. So this was no easy, calm thing. So you can see some of these numbers. See how bad some of these attacks were. Kobe lost almost 60%, Osaka was 35%, Shizuoka, 61%, or 66%. So these are huge, huge, huge just levels of destruction. You can see the fires raging. So places like Tokyo, which are still made of primarily wood, burned like crazy when we firebombed them. Now in February of 1945, you have the Yalta Accords. So this is just as Berlin's invaded right before Hitler kills himself. All three leaders, so Russia, the United States, and England, agree on one thing: the creation of a new body called the United Nations. So a more robust version of the League of Nations. Now, Stalin says all the territory that the Soviet army is currently occupying, they're keeping, will give them independence, but they're going to fall under Soviet and communist control. Because Stalin and Russia does not want to be invaded. Again, they want these buffer states to kind of protect them if they should be invaded. Now for Berlin and Germany. Berlin's going to be divided, and Germany is going to be divided between several zones, each controlled by one of the major powers. And it's at this same time that FDR is going to get reelected again in 1944, making it the beginning of his fourth term. However, due to complications to his disease, polio, plus other illnesses, he ends up dying in office, and Harry S. Truman is going to take over as president and be sworn in. And almost immediately after Truman takes office, some military officers come in and inform him. So they have another meeting, which they basically affirm everything. But they inform him that the nuclear bomb is done. He's like, what the hell's a nuclear bomb? So they decide, and he gets demonstrations. So they have the Manhattan Project. They tell him all about it, about this massive, destructive bomb that can wipe out a whole city single-handedly. So there's not a lot of debate if we're going to use it, but it's just how we're going to make the best use of it. And as a result, you have the decision to drop the first atomic bomb on Japan. And so was that the Enola Gay in the pre-dawn darkness of August 6 of 1945 took off with a bomb named Little Big Boy for the industrial city of Hiroshima. And early that morning, they dropped the bomb and incinerated the city, killing over 100,000 people. 3 days later, another B-29 named Boxcar dropped another atomic bomb over Nagasaki, much to the same effect. And thus the new nuclear era began. Now, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was actually in Hiroshima on the day of the first bombing. He was on the outskirts of the city, so he saw the bombing happen. He actually left and returned to his hometown of Nagasaki, which he saw the second bomb get dropped and managed to endure and survive both atomic explosions. He just happened to be in the city, but far enough away that he survived both. He actually lived to the age of 93. But you can see here the horrors of this. This is a young boy carrying his younger sibling that had died in the blast to be buried. And it's at this point, the Emperor of Japan went on the radio and asked his own people to stand down, to surrender. He did not want to see any more destruction. And aboard the battleship Missouri docked in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, Japan signed its formal surrender. And so after 50 million lives had been lost, the war was over. And everybody is celebrating. People are cheering all around the world that the war is finally over. But much like after the war in Europe, the war in the Pacific has some horrors. Not nearly as bad as the Holocaust and concentration camps, but still pretty horrific. The Japanese were not much kinder to their prisoners than the Germans were. But nonetheless, they get to go home. They survived and they endured, and the war is over. So you have this new era of the 1950s, late 40s, early 1950s beginning, and it's an era of Cold War. While the main war is over, the Cold War is slowly beginning. You have tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Former allies are now budding enemies as this Cold War slowly begins, and the tug of war internationally between communism and the Soviet Union and capitalism, democracy, and the United States. And in other areas, since Superman and other heroes had no longer the Nazis to fight, they had to fight someone else, and so they switched to fighting the Ku Klux Klan. But we'll stop there for today, and we will pick up with the Cold War next time.